Thanks everybody for coming. I'm Sue Sheridan. I am the director of the Nebraska Center for Research on Children, Youth, Families, and Schools. And I also have the privilege of serving as the lead of the Early Learning Network, which is, I think, probably one of the first networks funded by IES 4 years ago. And it is my privilege today to moderate a session where we'll be talking about a very critical part of the network mission, and that is identifying and exploring methods by which programs, really learning programs, can not only begin to close the achievement gap for children from disadvantaged or diverse backgrounds, but actually maintain that gain that children experience during pre-K. So we will be talking today a little bit about the backdrop to this network work, the network research that's occurring across the country, but really I'll turn it over to my colleagues who represent 4 different research teams situated within the network that are collectively identifying these really critical issues in the area of early learning. So some of you probably have heard about the Early Learning Network. We've been presenting every year since we've been funded, and we have the opportunity and really, the pleasure of talking about advances that we're making year to year, because collectively we are all doing really important work that not only looks immediately at what's happening for young children as they experience preschool across the country, but longitudinally how those children are progressing and identifying important practices and policies that, again, not only identify how we can begin understanding that those methods to close the gap, but really to maintain the gains and the boost that preschool provides for young children at risk. That is our mission. It's a very clear mission. It's a very simple mission. If you think about it, we really are about advancing our understandings of the policies and the practices that narrow the achievement gap and then help to maintain that boost that preschool children experience. The teams representing the network research are diverse, and although we have very common aims and goals associated with our research, the manner in which we're operationalizing those and putting those into practice vary. And you'll hear a little bit about 4 different teams now in terms of how we are each representing that common mission in our own unique ways. One of the objectives of the RFA, if any of you remember seeing it, it seems to be years and years ago, was that we wanted to understand context and the role that not only policy but also context plays when it comes to understanding the learning trajectories of young children. And so there's some geographic diversity represented among our teams. You will hear from programs representing the Boston Public Schools. Meghan McCormick will be talking about a research study occurring there, co-led by faculty at MDRC and University of Michigan. You'll hear from Peg Burchinal and her team at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I didn't skip Iheoma. I'm just going geographically. And so you won't hear from the UVA team, but you will hear from a team represented by Iheoma Iruka, who's going to be talking about research that's occurring in Nebraska. And there's also a team at Ohio State University, as well as Carol Connor's team at University of California at Irvine. The majority of these teams are conducting these common research studies, which I'll describe in just a minute. Carol's team is unique in a lot of ways, one of which is that they are developing, piloting, and validating an assessment tool that all of us are collaborating on to assist in that important development work. So the study that you'll hear her talk about is a little bit different, but yet is able to still answer some of these common questions that we have. We all are charged, with the exception of Carol's team, the research teams are all charged to address 3 primary studies within our work. And so the first is a descriptive study where we are looking very intently on policies and practices that support early learning. So we're all going across our unique states or contexts and understanding the kinds of things that are happening at a very macro level that could be influencing children's immediate experiences in the classroom setting. We're also all doing a deep dive into classroom processes and practices by observing, some of us using very common tools, some using very unique tools, but really all understanding what it is that children are experiencing in their day-to-day lives in preschool, in kindergarten, and in grades 1 through 3. The third study is very exciting. It's a longitudinal study where we're actually tracking children from pre-K into grade 3. These are children who are primarily in Title I programs, who are low SES, who are diverse in many ways, and we're understanding the malleable factors that influence their learning in an attempt to then be able to describe what it is that we really need to provide to these kiddos to not only help them achieve to the best of their potential in their pre-K experience, but more important, or at least equally importantly, to continue to maintain that gain as they progress through 3rd grade. So this paper today, these sets of papers today, are critically and keenly associated with the goal and the purpose of this whole IES meeting this week, and that is understanding how to really understanding the achievement gap and identifying processes and practices that might be able to close it. We know that children who are less versus more advantaged are clearly these kinds of gaps. Begin early in life, and they often sustain throughout life, not only in academic areas, but social emotional learning and behavioral domains as well. But we really need to understand more effectively and empirically how to improve and sustain the learning and behavioral outcomes that young children who are in publicly funded pre-K programs can begin to sustain the gains that they're making in order to really sort of keep that gap closed. So the kinds of questions that we'll be answering today are: to what extent do pre-K programs close the achievement gaps that exist by income, race, ethnicity, and language? How do learning and behavior gaps change across children's academic trajectories into and throughout the early elementary years? And what are some of these malleable factors that support academic and behavioral gains? Do they actually close the achievement gap during pre-K and beyond? So we'll be hearing, as I mentioned, from Meghan McCormick, from Iheoma Iruka, from Peg Burchinal, and from, I thought it was going to be Ashley, but it's Carol Connor.
Carol Connor.
Sorry, Carol.
Split.
Yes, okay. And we are very privileged to have Michael Lopez as serving as the discussant this morning. So each team will take about 15 minutes. We'll have a few minutes where Michael can wrap it up, and then plenty of time for Q&A. Thank you.
Sue. I'm just going to preface this by saying I'm battling a cough, so my apologies if something happens during this talk involving my sickness. So I am representing a team that is composed of researchers from MDRC, Boston Public Schools Department of Early Learning, the Harvard Graduate School of Education, with the PI being Catherine Snow, and the University of Michigan, with our collaborator being Christina Weiland. And Jason Sachs from the Boston Public Schools is actually on the phone listening in. So if folks have practitioner-oriented questions, he's available. I'm volunteering him. So as Sue said, we're really interested in this field and understanding achievement gaps. So we have tons of descriptive research at this point, thanks in large part to folks at Stanford who have compiled a lot of this work, demonstrating substantial gaps between higher income and lower income students and white and non-white students prior to the start of kindergarten. So kids are generally starting kindergarten. Kids who are from lower income and racial ethnic minority backgrounds are starting kindergarten, coming in scoring maybe between half a standard deviation and a standard deviation below their white and higher income peers in terms of language and math assessments. And we also know that those gaps actually don't tend to shrink during school. So recent work by Paul von Hippel examining ECLSK data across kindergarten through 3rd grade has demonstrated those gaps stay fairly similar across time, shrinking a tiny bit in kindergarten and 1st grade, but pretty much demonstrating what we found in the field of sociology, showing that educational systems actually help perpetuate achievement gaps rather than closing them, which is really kind of a core goal of early learning. enrollment in pre-K has actually been identified as one key strategy for reducing achievement gaps prior to kindergarten entry. So in addition to the host of work showing that in general, kids who attend a high-quality pre-K program show up to kindergarten performing better than kids who don't, there's other experimental evidence demonstrating that Hispanic students, dual language learner students, and students from low-income families tend to show the biggest, or experience the biggest benefits of a high-quality pre-K program. So we've seen that in the Head Start Impact Study and some other meta-analytic work. There's other studies, though, more recently perhaps, that haven't really demonstrated these additional benefits for lower-income kids, Hispanic students, and dual language learners. And so there's really more work needed to understand kind of the key factors in pre-K classrooms that not only benefit students in general, but actually are playing this compensatory role in actually closing achievement gaps and helping students who are showing up to school with lower levels of academic, social, emotional, executive functioning skills catch up to their higher performing peers. In our study, we're actually able to leverage data from the Boston Public Schools pre-kindergarten program to examine what types of classroom level factors might really be most instrumental for actually closing race-based and income-based achievement gaps. So you all likely know there's a large existing evidence base on the effects of the Boston Public Schools pre-kindergarten program on students. So Chris Weiland and Hiro Yoshikawa's 2013 regression discontinuity study demonstrated substantial impacts on language, literacy, math, and executive functioning skills. There's also been work demonstrating that we think Boston is maybe a best bet as a high quality program in terms of implementing 2 evidence-based curricula that are explicitly focused on supporting the domains of language and literacy and math, paired with coaching and training for teachers. So a fairly robust professional development model in place in this pre-K program. The slots in the pre-K program, it's not right now a universal program, so slots are allocated via lottery, but the district is moving towards a UPK model with a mixed auspice delivery system. Everything I'm presenting today is really gonna hone in on our particular study sample though, which consists of kids in the formal pre-kindergarten program in public schools, as well as students who actually experienced the Boston pre-kindergarten model, but were enrolled at community-based organizations that were partnering with the district to implement the model with funds supported by preschool expansion grant funding. And so we're gonna be looking at public schools as well as community-based organizations here today. Our key research questions are, in a diverse district like Boston that has a model that is not necessarily targeted, so all students can access the pre-kindergarten program, how large are race and income-based achievement gaps in language and math skills at pre-K entry? And do those gaps actually close or change across pre-K and kindergarten or not? So in this particular district, do we see similar patterns to what Von Hippel and others have shown? And then kind of the more interesting perhaps question for thinking about future policy and practice is, do the following classroom level factors in pre-K reduce achievement gaps in pre-K and kindergarten? So theories have been exposed that perhaps in classrooms with higher levels of process quality, we may see bigger benefits for lower income and racial ethnic minority children. Exposure to more advanced instructional content, more time exposed to unconstrained versus constrained instructional content, which I'll explain a little bit. More time in different learning formats, so small versus larger groups, and more time just generally spent in the learning domains of math and language and literacy. In our study, we recruited 20 public elementary schools to participate. They were all offering the Boston Public Schools pre-K program, and 10 community-based organizations implementing the same model. But there's a difference in that the teachers who are implementing the public school model are public school teachers who are paid on the same type of schedule as union teachers in the K-12 system. The community-based organization teachers are not in that same setup. Our sample is very diverse, which is a strength to doing a study on achievement gaps. So in most of my other work, I've actually worked with very within group samples. So we don't necessarily have the ability to compare the effects of programs for higher income versus lower income students because everybody in the sample is lower income. But in a district like Boston that's attracting a whole range of students to its pre-K program, we have the ability to actually compare different groups. And so you can see that our sample is composed of about 25% white students, about 32% Black students. The blue bars are the study sample, and the green bars are showing that this is generally representative of the broader population of BPS students in kindergarten. And overall, it's about 25% white. We have about 22% Black students, about 32% Hispanic students, and overall, about 60% of students are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. And we're using that as our proxy for higher versus lower income, so higher income students being those not eligible for free lunch. We're able, and all of these data are accessible to us via administrative records from the district. I wanted to show some of the pre-K teacher characteristics so you can see kind of what the makeup of the pre-K teaching experiences and education levels. So you can see their teachers in the sample are racially and ethnically diverse. They're mostly female, and about 70% of the teachers do have a master's degree. The reason most, if not all of the teachers in the public school sample do have a master's degree. The data sources we're using for this study are composed of direct child assessments that we did in the field with our study sample, which is composed of 386 students, administrative records, parent surveys, classroom observations, and pre-K teacher surveys. The key outcomes that we're honing in on here are one assessment of math skills and one assessment of language skills. So for math, we're using the Woodcock-Johnson applied problems, and for language skills, we're using the PPVT assessment of receptive vocabulary. We assessed a host of covariates in the fall of pre-K because one key part of this network is that none of these studies are experimental. So we're trying to use these observational data to do as rigorous of an assessment as we can as to the extent to which these malleable factors are really truly associated with these outcomes. The predictors of interest, when we're talking about classroom process quality, we're using the CLASS, so the three domains of the class: emotional support, instructional support, classroom organization. We created a measure of advanced versus basic instructional content that kids are exposed to based on teachers' report on the ECLSK items, so different kind of like learning activities that happen in the classroom. Teachers reported on whether they do them or not, and whether they're a major focus of instruction or not. And then we actually used Common Core standards to code those as being on grade or above grade, which would be more advanced. And this work is really rooted in some of Mimi Engel, Amy Clayson's work, looking at or finding that kids who are exposed to more advanced instructional content, regardless of who they are, benefit in early elementary school. We then used actually observations of individual students in the classroom to code measures of exposure to constrained versus unconstrained content, the amount of time that individual students were exposed to math and language and literacy instruction, and the amount of time that kids were exposed to small versus large groups. So this is the individualizing student instruction observational measure that co-panelist Carol Connor has been instrumental in developing. We actually videotape each of the classrooms, and then we individually code each student's exposure to a host of different instructional formats. And that is a really big strength of this measure, as it allows us to code things at the individual student level, which, over and above providing more statistical power, allows us to capture the fact that there's a lot of variation across individual students within the same classrooms. And especially in a study of achievement gaps, where we know that higher income students might be exposed to different types of instruction than lower income students, this individual measure allows us to more explicitly examine that. So the results, because I'm going over to my time, in general, we see a fairly similar pattern to what folks have found in the field. There are substantial achievement gaps, as you can see, between higher income kids and lower income kids. Higher income kids here are represented by the red bar, so not eligible for free and reduced price lunch, whereas there's a purple bar at the bottom that is one of the bottom bars, which are kids who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. This is the standard score in the PPVT, so you can see the national norm is 100, and our kids who are eligible for free reduced price lunch are scoring about 10 points below that, whereas our kids who are not eligible for free lunch are scoring about 12 points above that. So it's about 2 standard deviation achievement gap at the beginning of pre-K, which within this sample in Boston. And for the most part, we find that those gaps are sustained across time. So there's small deviances across time, but you don't necessarily see a huge change overall if you take the whole sample into account. And we see a very similar pattern, if not more striking, for math. So kids show up with pretty big gaps, and those are pretty much sustained across time. So the question is, where do we see the gaps closing? In what types of classrooms? And what types of exposure to instructional content? We use an individual growth model in this study to examine growth across the fall and spring of pre-K and the fall and spring of kindergarten. And so our main predictor is a pre-K level measure, but we're actually establishing how that links to growth across time across those 2 years. And so these are the models for examining outcomes from classroom level predictors and student level predictors. Our results, I'm going to show you the significant results first. First key finding is that income-based achievement gaps in math skills appear to lessen through kindergarten when teachers teach more advanced math content in pre-K. So when teachers report that they're teaching things that are, we've coded above pre-K grade level, we see it's not a huge difference, but you can see this green bar right here. Those are the kids who are low income and exposed to high advanced content. That's their trajectory, versus the kids in the blue bar, who are the low income kids who are exposed to lower levels of advanced content. And so being exposed to advanced content seems to close gaps in a way that for higher income students, it doesn't seem to make a difference whether they were exposed to more or higher advanced content, which is a little bit different than the ECLSK, Claessens and Engel finding, which showed advanced content benefited everyone the same. We also found that time spent in what we're calling unconstrained instruction. So these are things like reading stories, discussing the world around you, engaging in center-based structured play, versus activities where kids are kind of being exposed to more like learning letter sounds, learning number sounds, which are also critical things that we know kids are exposed to. The finding though is that when they're exposed to more time in unconstrained instruction, controlling for the amount of time in constrained instruction, we do see that income-based achievement gaps in language skills lessen through kindergarten. So again, here what you're interested in is the green bar versus the blue bar. So that's the difference in the lower income kids exposed to more unconstrained instruction versus the lower income kids exposed to less. We see a similar pattern, income-based achievement gaps in math skills lessen through kindergarten when children are exposed to more unconstrained math instruction. And we see that race-based gaps in language skills between non-white and white students lessen through kindergarten when children are exposed to more unconstrained language instruction. Similar pattern, when kids are exposed to more math instruction, it appears to decrease income-based achievement gaps. So just overall, more math instruction seems to be good in this correlational study for reducing achievement gaps across time. This was the biggest, the magnitude of this effect and this difference was the biggest of all the factors that we tested. But we did not find any evidence that higher scores on class reduce achievement gaps. We didn't find any evidence that spending more time in small groups reduces achievement gaps. And what really seemed to be difficult to change were race-based achievement gaps. That could be a function of the statistics in that, when you have a small sample size and you start breaking things up by 4 or 5 different racial ethnic groups, we may not have the statistical power in the study to really truly examine that. But that was a key finding, is that income-based achievement gaps actually seemed a little more malleable to these different factors. This is just a quick summary of what I went through. Some key limitations and directions for future research. As I noted, having a larger sample size, it's a huge strength of this study that we have such fine-grained measures of individual kids' exposure to different content in the classroom. But that also means we need we have 386 kids in this study. Having like 1,000 kids would be better if we really wanted to break it up into different racial ethnic groups. And a huge limitation of the study is that we can't really, due to the statistical power, examine intersectionality of racial, ethnic, and low and high income groups. The study is non-causal, so we need more work to understand the robustness of the findings. And a huge direction for future research that I'm interested in is the fact that these things don't all operate in isolation. So teachers that are doing more math are probably also doing more unconstrained math instruction. So thinking about profiles of classrooms and how different profiles might actually, that might be more relevant to policymakers and practitioners to think about the core set of practices and how they operate together. And we're going to continue examining these findings through 3rd grade, as that's when we're funded to collect data currently. We do think these are really interesting for kind of working with practitioners about not just like what are the best practices for these pre-K classrooms, but when teachers are serving high percentages of low-income kids or racial ethnic minority kids, what are the specific practices that we should be supporting them to implement in their classrooms? If a core goal of the district is really to use a high-quality pre-K program to reduce achievement gaps. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. And for those who are still standing, there are seats over there. I feel terrible when people are standing, especially for such a topic where I think it requires a lot of energy. So first, thank you for attending our session. As Sue noted, my name is Iruka, and I am at HighScope Research Education Foundation. And I have many connections to, I went to BPS, Boston Public School. I lived in Nebraska. I live in North Carolina, though I work in Michigan. So all confusing, but that's not why we're here really. So the title of our paper, and I'm part of the Nebraska team, is Beyond the Achievement Gap Gazing, and examining really what's reducing the mechanisms, right? Because we could all stand here and talk about the gap, right? But we have to think about what could we really do to really change it. And I think based on this morning's sort of call to action that, we have to do more. So with that, I'll just say, I'm going to give you my take home for those who have to escape out the door, but at least you'll know the take home, and then obviously I'll talk about sort of the results, et cetera, et cetera. But obviously want to acknowledge a host of people that make our work possible. Sue's the PI for Nebraska, and the rest of our colleagues are all around the room. So I want to acknowledge so many people that make this work. So what are the take-home points? So for those who are curious, so gaps still remain even after we account for socioeconomic status and pre-K. Again, there's always a narrative about only class-based gaps, but the gaps really do still remain even after that. So we have to acknowledge that no matter what. So there's a need to continue to focus on what could close the gap. And from our findings, you'll see that there's more supports that needed to strengthen the homeschool connection to reduce the Black-white gaps. But there's a need for more culturally relevant constructs, approaches, factors to explain the Latino white gaps. And then there's a need for us to continue to do this work to examine how much does the gap continue over time, and how much do these malleable factors that I'll talk about, will they reduce the gaps over time as well? So just a quick sort of rationalization for our study, and I think it's helpful so you understand the framing for our particular paper. So there is some indication, I said earlier, that much of the racial gaps are explained by family socioeconomic status. Fine. And that's primarily family income. However, there are still a lot of indications that gaps still persist between white and Black children and Latino and white children, above and beyond SES. So what are the potential malleable factors that could reduce or eliminate the gaps? So we really turn to sort of the ecosystem frameworks that really influence children's early learning. So we all know ad nauseum the Bronfenbrenner bioecological framework and the multiple systems. No, we all know that. We all use it. But I also want to make sure that you understand that we use that as a framework, as well as the Garcia-Cole et al. Model that really talks about the integrative study of minority children's competencies, which acknowledges the systematic nature of inequities that exist in our system, which is why a lot of children of color tend to be poor, and also the gaps are there racially, as Megan has also noted in her paper. But with these frameworks, they really emphasize the importance of both home, school, that are formative environments. They also note the interactions and the connections between those two environments, as well as macro systems that also play a role in the gaps that we see. So really the core research aims for this particular paper is to first uncover the racial differences in the kindergarten malleable factors that we focus on. And we focus really on three big ones, which is the home-based parenting practices, school classroom practices, namely the class, and then homeschool connection. So looking at whether there are actual racial differences in those malleable factors that we have identified, and then discern whether or not those identified malleable factors actually eliminate or reduce the gaps at the end of kindergarten. So I'll just briefly just go through sort of our methodology. And so we have about 300 children in our Nebraska site early learning network study. And you can see here it's predominantly white, 54% white, which is typical of the state, actually, 50% Black in our sample, and then 32% Latino children, and both from urban and rural districts. And so our study variables that we really focus on for this particular paper is the end of kindergarten outcomes. So expressive vocabulary, reading achievement, math achievement, social skills, and problem behaviors. Again, using standardized measures that most of us are probably familiar with. Happy to talk to you about them if needed, but I only have so much time, so I'm gonna just not bother describing them. And then the Malleable factors that we did incorporate are the home-based practices and homeschool connection from the family involvement questionnaire from Jan Fratuzzo, and then also looking at the classroom emotional and instruction support from the class, as well as the home join-in factor from the parent-teacher relationship scale. And then we included a host of covariates, which includes the pre-K scores, pre-K attendance, gender, age, etc. And then most importantly, maternal education and family income. And then I'll talk about sort of our analyses in the next couple of slides, which is basically regression analyses. Excuse me. So first, we want to sort of just examine, are there racial differences in the actual outcome? I think that's the first query. So we do see here that there are significant white-Black gap differences in expressive language, in math, and in problem behaviors. And so it favors white children across the board in terms of the white children score higher than Black children in expressive language and math, and then teachers report Black children having higher problem behaviors, again, at the end of kindergarten for this particular study. In terms of the Latino-white gap, we see a significant difference at the end of kindergarten for all of the expressive language, and all the reading and math achievement outcomes. But we don't see any in terms of the teacher-rated social skills or problem behaviors, which is sort of consistent, actually, with a lot of the national studies. So looking at the malleable factors, so if you remember, I sort of mentioned that we sort of looking at three sort of buckets. One is the home practices, home-based involvement, which is parent-reported. And then we have the classroom quality, which is observation using the class tool. And then we have parent report and teacher reports. One is conferencing, which is parent-reported. And then join-in, reported by parents, and then reported by teachers. And the join-in measure is really about how much do teachers and parents say that they connect with each other, have a relationship, that sort of thing. And so you do see that parents actually, so Black parents report having engaged in more home practices, as well as having more homeschool conferencing compared to white families. And then white parents report that they have a better relationship with their teacher, and similarly, white teachers report that they have better relationship with white parents. Regarding the Latino-white difference in Malleable factors, we only have one, which is Latino parents reporting they have more homeschool conference than their white families. So we do have some differences when we look at the Malleable factors. So now to the more interesting part of things. So I want to walk you through just really quickly. So this is really sort of the crux of it. So first we're going to look at the Black-white gap, and then we'll look at the Latino white gap. I know some of the people in the corner can't see, so you can move around. I know it's kind of an odd setup. So I want to kind of just walk through this. So what we try to do is first say, look at doing an unconditional model, which is that first line over there. Can I use my clicker? Okay, I can't go that far. It's like right there, right? So you can read, sorry. Even if you can't see the numbers, don't worry. I'll try to talk for those who are outside the door as well. So at least you can understand. I know it's a lot here. So we first look at the extent to which the Malleable factors eliminate or reduce the racial disparities where they exist. So for the Black-white gap, we see the gap existed for expressive language measured by the EVT, and then the math measured by the Wilcox-Johnson, and then the problem behaviors measured by the SSIS. And so we first looked at the unconditional model, like what is the gap at the end of kindergarten? And we do see, obviously, at least a 0.56 across the board, about half a standard deviation across the board. And so what we did next, we added the covariates. So we added pre-K status, whether they were in pre-K or not, their pre-K scores. We added home family income, wealth, etc. So we added a set of covariates. Again, because we want to make sure we take into account those covariates. But I want to make sure I note, just because you're including your model doesn't mean that they don't have an impact. But anyways, we'll leave that for discussion points. So then after that, we then enter in separately the malleable factors. So after we enter into covariates, we then enter in the home practices, look at this unique effects on the gap, whether it reduces it or not. And then we take that out and enter in the homeschool connection variables, and then take that out, and then enter in the classroom quality variables, and then take that out. And then the final UBA model will include everything in the covariates and the malleable factors. So as you can see, let's go with expressive vocabulary for the black-white gap. We see a gap exists. We enter in the covariates, the gap is no longer significant, statistically significant. So you see a big reduction there. And you can see as we enter in the different malleable factors, there's some drop, actually one of them we actually increase, but there's not a big movement when you enter them in separately. And even when you enter them all together, there's not a lot of movement in terms of reducing it any further beyond the covariates. So similarly with the Woodcock-Johnson math, once we enter in the covariates, the gap is no longer significant, and then we enter in the home practices, et cetera, et cetera. And the things to note is that the homeschool connection, the addition of that does seem to further reduce the gap that we see by about, I think I did the math here, by about 33%. So the homeschool connection seems to reduce it further by 33%. We do the same thing with the problem behaviors, and we see the gap actually reduces, particularly when we enter in the homeschool connection, we see a gap decrease of about 45% as well. Thank you, Caroline. So there's a lot in terms of that once we enter in the covariates, a lot of the gaps between Black and white children seems to decrease. And there's some indication the homeschool connection may be one of the levers in terms of further reducing the gaps at the end of kindergarten, above and beyond the covariates. So now turning to the Latino white gap. So pay attention to this one. So we did the same exact analytical process. As you can see here, we have gaps, and as I noted earlier, there's gaps in expressive language, in reading, and in math. And you can see the unconditional model, we had about 1.25 standard deviation difference in expressive language for between Latino and white children. But as we enter into covariates, particularly for that one, the gap reduces significantly, about 76%. But as you can see there, as we enter in each of those malleable factors, nothing really changes. And this is kind of the pattern for both reading and for math. So once we enter into covariates, it takes up a lot, it obviously addresses a lot of the gap, but then the rest of those malleable factors don't add any more new information or new explanatory information. So really, in terms of just what is the sort of the take home from sort of our analyses thus far, is that when we're looking at the Black-white gap beyond the covariates, we don't see any evidence that any of our malleable factors to date are explaining the gap in expressive language. There is some indication that homeschool connection may be a lever for both math, but also for problem behaviors. And it may be a slight indication for classroom practices for problem behaviors, again, noting that it's teacher rated. However, when we look at the Latino white gap, we see that there's none of our, at least current malleable factors explain that gap, particularly when we look at the expressive vocabulary tests. So what do we sort of make of this? So what I want to say is that the end of kindergarten gaps, they don't exist in every outcome for every sort of pattern, but there's still racial differences in the malleable factors. So even if we take into account the gap, there's still differences that we see in the malleable factors. And the interesting part is that the Black-white gap in expressive language still remains even after we take into account the covariates, the malleable factors, et cetera. So there's something that's sort of either the measure or something else is going on there. And then we do see at least that the homeschool connection is a potential lever for reducing the Black-white gap in children for math and problem behaviors. But again, no indication of malleable factors that really matter to reduce the Latino white gaps. So in conclusion, I'll just say a few things because I think I still got time. Okay, good. That we should continue to think about, I think Megan, you said it beautifully too, that while we look at these things sort of as separate things, we know that they're connected and interconnected. So we need to continue to think about how they individually impact in terms of malleable factors and how they work sort of together for some of the gaps that we're seeing. And we clearly know that there's an importance for homeschool connection. And we can talk about why, and I can give you my theory as to why that matters, or you can read my books and papers and all that, as well as Suze and team. But I think what's actually also, I think what this should remind us is that, particularly for the Latino white gap, that we have to do more in terms of what constructs what practices are we looking at, right? Are we looking at it through the white Eurocentric lens, or should we think about things that really matter for particular groups of children who actually live in a particular system that's not Eurocentric and middle class in some instances? And then we need to continue to examine the gap. And I want to sort of avoid saying, let's examine it, keep examining it, but we need to examine it in context of what's going to help change it over time. And I do want to make sure I note limitations, no causal inferences here, no generalizability here. We're really looking at some very just specific malleable factors. We can continue to do more. And while we included all these covariates, it's unlikely that we muted all of its impacts, right? So just because you control for it, which I don't know, I really have an issue of controlling for race and some of these other things, it doesn't mean you muted what it means. So most importantly, I want to sort of just convey the following, that gaps beget gaps. So if you have a gap in pre-K or before school, the gap is still there. It follows you, right? So just like our federal government, if you have a deficit 1 year, you don't pay it off, it balloons into a huge debt. Like, that is just the reality of it. So as much as I want to say that we reduce the gap, we actually have it in reality, right? So because kids are carrying that over time and over generations. But I do want to note the heterogeneity in Black children and in Latino children. They're not a monolithic group. There's many children of color doing fine. And so I want to make sure I acknowledge that. We need to also think about how do we think about things from a strength-based perspective and not say that we need to look at the gaps all the time. There are many measures out there that we're not using that shows the strengths that many children, particularly children of color, bring to the school that's never really acknowledged, whether it's emotional regulation, flexible use of language, cooperation, bilingual competence, bicultural competence. So we need to think beyond that whole thing as well. So I would say, from this morning, I think our charge is that there's urgency for this work. And I think our job should be not just to sort of, a lot of us are in this room because of the achievement gap, but hopefully we can actually work our way out of a job because we've actually addressed it. But I know, for me, I'm a realist. We have a lot of work to do and we're not moving fast enough. So I thank you and look forward to our conversation.
Okay, well, I'm very pleased to be here today, and I want to thank you all for coming to listen to us. Before I get started, I want to say that while I am talking, I am representing the whole team, which includes Mary Bratch Hines, Ellen Peisner-Feinberg, and every other person who has been part of our team. And we're all just so pleased to be part of the Early Learning Network, and we would really like to thank IES for that. So I'm going to talk today about the gaps that we see among Black, Latinx, and white children who have enrolled in the pre-K program in North Carolina and enrolled in our study. We want to describe these gaps from pre-K through grade 1, and we want to ask questions about whether selected classroom characteristics may account for those gaps. As everybody's been talking about, it's clear the gaps emerge early. You often find these gaps by age 2 or 3. So by the time children are entering kindergarten, they're very apparent. We see gaps both between children of different races, as well as income-related gaps. It's clear in this country these two are confounded due to historic racism and institutional racism and other factors. So one of the reasons we are very interested in looking at gaps within a rural area is that within a targeted pre-K program is that we have eliminated some of the income issues by looking only at children who have been enrolled in a targeted pre-K program. We also wanted to look at it in a rural area because one of the big factors that has been implicated in the fact that the gaps get larger as kids go to school, is the fact that the quality of education and the degree of segregation of the schools have been implicated in the gaps. And within rural areas, because each school serves a much wider geographic area, you probably have less segregation than you might in a more urban area. So our research questions are, first of all, starting with children who enroll in the NC Pre-K program, a targeted program that largely serves low-income children, What kind of gaps do we see when the children enter the program? Are there gaps between white and black children, between white and Latinx children? What happens as the children progress through the pre-K program into kindergarten and into grade 1? Do we see changes in those gaps, and are they occurring during the school year, during the summer? Are they occurring in pre-K, kindergarten, first grade? So we really wanted to very carefully look at what happens to the gaps as the children go from entry to pre-K to the end of grade 1. And then what do we see at the end of grade 1, where we ended our data collection as of now. We're now in second grade, so we will be able to report on gaps later on once we've collected those data. But we're very interested in looking at how gaps emerged after children enter school. And then finally, we really wanted to ask whether characteristics of the classrooms seem to account for these gaps. Things like classroom quality and the ethnic composition of the classroom. So our sample is in North Carolina. It's the 6 counties that are kind of within that circle within central North Carolina. We randomly selected pre-K programs within these 6 counties. 63 pre-K classrooms were selected that were in 45 programs, most of which were in public schools. From those classrooms, we recruited 455 children. 350 have data in the fall, and then we really tried to enhance our sample to get more DLL children so that we have a larger sample for the spring. Our 455 children, most of them come from low-income families. About a third are white, Black, and Latinx, and 80% of the mothers have a high school education or less. We collect data on these children in the fall and spring. We really want to thank the schools for letting us in and being so cooperative. We collect data on children's language skills, reading skills, math, executive functioning, and social skills using the Woodcock-Johnson, the DIBELS, the NIH Toolbox, and 3 measures of where teachers rate their relationship with the children's learning behaviors, and then the last one is their children's behavior issues, behavior problems, using the Hightower measure. Oh, and from using the scales from these 3 measures, there's about 20 scales that come out of these 3 measures. We conducted a factor analysis that yields 2 factors, one that reflects social skills and another reflects self-regulation. And this is consistently found across time. So we then just summarize the data as social skills or self-regulation. We also go in every winter and collect classroom characteristics, measuring the classrooms with the class, and then we have teachers fill out a questionnaire that reports on the proportion of the class that is Latinx, the proportion that's Black, and their ethnicity. So then we can look at the match between that child and their teacher in terms of ethnicity. So first, turning to the classroom ethnic composition. We find that the Latinx children are more likely to be in classrooms with a higher proportion of Latinx children. The Black children are more likely to be in classrooms with a higher proportion of Black children. That there are very large differences in the proportion of children of color among the 3 groups, with both the Latinx and the Black children being much more likely to have a higher proportion of children of color in their classrooms. And the white children are much more likely to have an ethnic match with their teacher because most of the teachers are white, and this increases over time. We also looked at the classroom quality. Using the class, we see that the Black children are in lower quality classrooms at every time point, and the Latinx children are in lower quality classrooms in grade 1. So then we want to describe the gaps over time, controlling for family characteristics, using hierarchical linear models, and then look at each of these subsequent time points to try to identify whether there are certain points in time when the gaps seem to grow or diminish. We want to focus on whether there are mean differences at entry to kindergarten, pre-K, and whether there are mean differences in the spring of grade 1. Our second set of analyses add these classroom characteristics and look at the extent to which they seem to reduce the gaps. So before, I'm going to go through our individual outcomes, but I want to give you an overview of the findings and then point out as I display each of the findings how similar they are across many of these outcomes. So in general, what we find is very little evidence of a black-white difference at entry to pre-K within this low-income sample in North Carolina, but the emergence of a small black-white difference by grade 1. For the Latinx versus white, we see huge differences at entry to pre-K, which is not surprising because we're testing Spanish-speaking children in English that markedly decrease over time and disappear for almost all outcomes. And we see some advantage of being Latinx in terms of social skills and cognitive flexibility that is inconsistently seen over time. Okay, so let me display this for you on the individual outcomes. So here you can see in terms of vocabulary skills, very little difference at entry between the black and the white children, but a small difference by grade 1 that is emerging after the kids have left pre-K. For the Latinx versus white children, a huge difference, a 1.6 standard deviation difference that is reduced down to a 0.6 standard deviation by grade 1. For letter word identification, oops, I thought I took that out. Okay, we see a similar pattern. The scale on this, because there's so much more growth in reading skills than there was in language skills, the scale is different, so you can't see the difference as well. But we see little or no difference between the black and the white children over time or at any time point, but we see a difference between the Latinx children at entry to pre-K that has disappeared by grade 1. For phonemic skills, phonemic awareness skills, we see no difference between anybody at any time. Applied problems, math skills, same pattern, no difference between the black and white children at entry to school. Small differences have emerged by grade 1. We see large differences, about a 0.8 standard deviation at entry to school between the Latinx children and the white children that has totally disappeared by the time that children are in grade 1. In terms of inhibitory control, as measured by the flankers test, we see a significant difference between black and white children that becomes non-significantly smaller over time. And the Latinx children, there's also a significant difference at entry, but it disappears by grade 1. Cognitive flexibility, a very similar pattern. Then when we look at social skills, we see the anticipated pattern of the Latinx children doing better and very little difference between the black and the white children in our sample, and the same thing for self-regulation. So those findings are summarized in this table where the differences are highlighted. We had really hoped to see something emerge that would suggest that we're really seeing differences occur at any given point in time. We don't really see much of a pattern of that, but I think what's really striking here is the fact between the black and the white children, no differences at entry to pre-K, differences that have emerged by grade 1. Latinx white children, we see a very different pattern, large differences when you test Spanish-speaking children in English at the entry to pre-K that have virtually disappeared by the time the children are in grade 1, and a pattern of advantage that somewhat disappears as the children go through school, at least in terms of cognitive flexibility. We add the classroom characteristics. We first look at how well they are related to our outcomes, and we also see no relationship between the class and our outcomes. We see very modest relationships between the proportion of children who are of color and teachers' rating of social skills. We add those variables into our model, and what is in yellow here are the consistent findings from the previous analyses. What's in blue are the findings that change. But I want to say the ones that change have changed from just barely being significant to just barely not being significant, or vice versa. So the change in effect size was never more than about 0.03. Similar pattern for the Latinx white children. We see virtually the same pattern, including these classroom characteristics. Very minor changes, but again, these changes were just right on the borderline, the difference is never greater than about a 0.03 effect size. So, in conclusion, we see achievement gaps that are smaller in our study than are typically reported. Now, this very well could be because we're looking at children who attended a targeted program, so they're only low income. It's central North Carolina, which is different, and it's rural, and it could be that the rurality part is accounting for why our gaps tend to be smaller. But there are two important trends that we see here. One is a disconcerting trend of no differences between the Black and the white children at entry to pre-K, and a difference that emerges once they get to school. And a reassuring trend that the Latinx children are showing marked gains, especially in pre-K and K, smaller gains in first grade, so that the gaps that are so large when the kids enter school have either disappeared or markedly declined, with some suggestion of advantage or strengths for the Latinx children in terms of especially teacher ratings of social skills. We find relatively few associations between the child outcomes and ethnic composition or class, so it's not surprising that when we include them as possible malleable factors to account for these gaps, they don't really make a difference. So I apparently don't have a thank you slide, but I'd like to say thank you very much.
All right. Well, and now for something completely different. First of all, thank you all for coming. There's a seat there, and there's a seat there, and there's a seat there, and there's 3 over there. So if you want to sit down, there's also 3 really easy to get to right there. But thank you, Sue, for organizing this. Thank you, Caroline, for being our program officer. It's really an exciting project. And, all right. So I'm going to veer off and talk about the observation system that we're developing as part of the Early Learning Network. And I just want to tell you that our co-authors not only include me, Ashley, and Deborah Vandell, but I also include Laura Justice from Ohio State and Sue Sheridan from Nebraska, because we're using their data. That's one of the really great things about the network is we don't have to travel all over the country. We have partners who are collecting data for us. So please keep in mind, I'm not going to talk about site differences today, but we did see marked site differences on the observation tool. All right, and then I want to also just disclose I do have a potential conflict of interest with Learning Ovations. UCI is scrupulous in looking at this, and so they have verified that our research is valid. And again, I want to thank IES for the funding. And of course, all the parents, teachers, and students who participate. All right, so OLOS, optimizing learning opportunities for students. So it's created, so the mission that IS charged us with was to create an observation system that predicted literacy, math, and social behavioral outcomes, and that could be used by practitioners, right? So it had to be low inference and easy to use. We decided that what we would do is we'd take our 3 validated, very difficult to use observation systems and combine, because they were validated and they do predict student outcomes, and create a technology-based version that would be very easy to use. And I just have to say that we're conducting a practitioner study right now, and our learning outcomes coaches actually got reliable faster than our researchers. So go teachers, right? So that's what OLOS is supposed to be. Here's what it looks like. I know you can't read that if you're in the back of the room, but essentially it combines the individualizing student instruction piece which is, I don't think our beam reaches that far. I'll try to use the mouse. There you go. So, which captures the amount and type and context of instruction, and then captures student talk. And this is from our Creating Opportunities to Learn from Text, which identifies 9 different types of student talk that predict students' outcomes. And then we have these 2 blue ones where we're trying to capture students' use of or demonstration of social behavioral skills, moving away from an opportunity or using their words to deal with a challenging situation. An example of some of the types of student talk from the COLT go all the way from nonverbal, like thumbs up if you hear the small A in BAT, to really higher level, like asking questions, participating in a discussion, or answering questions that require thinking and reasoning. For the ISI part, we capture literacy, we capture math. We also have an other category that captures art, music, mealtime, social studies, science. But since our charge was literacy and math, we have more detail in literacy and math. In literacy, we look at both code focus, so phonological awareness, phonics, letters, letter sounds, as well as meaning focus, which is comprehension, reading books, anything that's going to build language skills is considered meaning focus. And then we have another category called play that's only available in pre-K and kindergarten, because guess what? First graders and third graders and second graders don't get to play unless they go out on the for recess, and we don't code that. So for math, we look at numbers. So this is their understanding of numbers and number sense, operation, addition, subtraction, algebra, geometry, and then applied, which is like weight and time and other kinds of measurement. So that's the OLOS system, and we focus on coding individual children in the classroom. We also code what the teachers are doing. The ISI part is the same. I'm not going to be presenting any of that because we have the individual students. But the teachers also have teacher talk codes. And our factor analysis showed that they fell into 3 different types of talk: instructional discourse, behavioral discourse. This is where they're saying crisscross applesauce to get the kids to calm down, and social emotional kinds of talking. Oh, how are you feeling? It sounds like you're feeling angry. It sounds like you're feeling happy. So we have those 3 factors. So let me tell you a little bit about this study. Our research question really was, what's predicting students' literacy, math, and social behavioral outcomes? And we're in the theme of the conference and in our talk, we're really looking at malleable factors. And if you think about the seminal work by Entwistle and Alexander, and also Peg's really encouraging, except for first grade, findings that, in fact, in the face of effective instruction, we can close gaps or we can make sure that they don't widen. I would love to know what's going on with your first graders. So we have all grades. And just to focus on the totals, which are right here, we have 21 first grade classrooms with 211 children, 8 kindergarten classrooms, 77 children, 10 first grade, 103 children, 9 second grade classrooms for 115 children, and 8 third grade classrooms with 71. What I did is some of our pre-K teachers taught morning and afternoon. So what I've done in the analysis is I've considered students nested in teachers, assuming that teachers would better capture the share variance than the classrooms, and it avoided a cross-classified situation, which is always good. So that's 567 children overall in the study. All right, so we assessed the children. We used 4 different assessments. Letters to Meaning is a web-based assessment that assesses letter ID, sound, word reading, spelling, and then sentence construction, where the kids are given a pool of words and they have to make a meaningful sentence out of that. So that's how we get to the meaning. Vocabulary, we use our word match game, which is a semantic matching task. Find the two words that go together. For math, we used applied problems. We are developing a math intervention, and Doug is hopefully going to help us do more with that. And then we have the head, toes, knees, shoulders, and I just have to give a shout out to Megan. We were postdocs and assistant professors when this started. Do you know how long this test has been around? Yeah. So you all know it's head, toes, and then we switch it up. So that's our measure of self-regulation and social behavioral skills. We assess the kids in the fall, then we observe, we assess them again, and we observe, then we observe again in the spring, and then we assess them for a final time. On average, we had a little more than 2 hours of observation. What we did is we did use OLOS Live. It can be used live or with videotape. Our partners sent us all their videotapes. We randomly assigned coders to code all the videotapes. We coded all the children for the entire length of the observation. And then we coded the teacher for the entire length of the observation. All right. I just want to point out these are preliminary findings. We're continuing the study into next year, where our other partners are going to be collecting data, and we'll have much more power and might and should at that point be able to look at subgroups. We can't do that now. All right, let's talk a little. How am I doing for time? Okay. Looking at non-instruction, there's an alarming amount of non-instruction, especially in pre-K and K. The only thing that makes you feel better is when you look at individual children, they don't tend to be off task, although there's tremendous variability, as you can see by the standard error bars. And that it really doesn't change from fall, winter to spring. Alarmingly small amounts of math in pre-K. Oh my goodness. Now there is variability. Some classrooms do more. It goes up to about 30 minutes on average in the rest of the grades. So let's look at what predicts math outcomes. I'm showing you this ugly HLM table, and I'm not going to stay on it, but I just want to show you that, as expected, third graders have higher W scores or developmental scale scores than pre-K. So these are all developmentally sensitive. You can see that for math, off task is really predicting a lot. The other thing I want to point out is here's our slope. There is no difference by grade in the rate at which children are learning math skills, which I thought was rather interesting. So first graders are learning math skills just as fast as third graders. All right, so let's look at the graphs. So the first thing is that guess what? More time in math, which is this green bar right here, predicts stronger outcomes in math than lower levels. And this is modeled at the upper and lower first and fourth quartile. But the other thing that's really interesting is more time in literacy is predicting better scores in math. I think it has to do with the nature of the applied problems and that it's very heavy in language. And here's the bad news. Those kids who are off task, it really matters. They're the green bar. They're not learning as much math. We look at self-regulation. The only thing that matters is kids who are off task tend to have weaker outcomes in self-regulation. It's probably a reciprocal effect, right? I'm not going to say that. So it's probably low self-regulation causing more time on task, which exacerbates the development of self-regulation. Let's look at language and literacy, total amounts. These are equated. So right here, we have code-focused instruction. And you can see, except for kindergarten, nobody's getting very much code-focused instruction, which is rather alarming given what we know about the importance of developing these foundational skills early on. We see a lot more meaning-focused instruction, except in pre-K, which is kind of disturbing because reading a book counts as meaning-focused instruction. If we look at play, we don't see any play in kindergarten. We see almost 40 minutes a day in pre-K, which is encouraging. So children who bring different constellations of skills to the classroom make greater gains when their instruction is individualized. And we have randomized control trials that show that we can, based on a constellation of language, comprehension, and decoding skills, we can actually predict how much of what types of instruction children should get. And we call this the distance from recommendation. And this slide just demonstrates how different we see those. These are the 4 groups, and the different colored bars are the different recommendations for that group. If we look at code focused, if the 0 means they're getting exactly the right amount, as you can see, except in kindergarten, none of the kids are, on average, are getting enough code focused instruction. And they're getting, except in pre-K and second grade, they're really getting more meaning-focused instruction than is optimal if you think of the class day as a zero-sum game. We see that they're getting very few opportunities to work independently on either the code or the meaning-based scores, which there is evidence. For example, sustained independent silent reading really builds reading skills. So I'm going to skip this and just show you. So here's what, so both teacher-managed meaning focused, or teacher-managed code focused, right? And you saw all those negative bars, and child-managed meaning focus predicted students' literacy scores. So this first bar shows that if they get the recommended amount, so we want a 0 distance from recommendation, they have the highest scores. It's an additive effect. If they get the right amount of code focus, but they don't get as much child-managed meaning focus, their scores are less. If they get not enough teacher-managed code focus, but they get the recommended amount of child-managed meaning focus, they do almost as well as if they get both. And if they get not enough of either one, we get the lowest scores. Wrap up. Okay, great. So when we look at teachers and child talk, just let me tell you that the more children are talking in the classroom and the less teachers are talking in the classroom, the stronger outcomes we get. It's that bar right there. And when we want to predict vocabulary, it turns out teachers' behavioral talk has a negative effect on vocabulary. So if children are talking a lot and teachers are using much less of this behavioral kind of talk, we get the strongest outcomes. And I'm going to stop there because I know I'm out of time, but I just want to point out that we're seeing really inequitable opportunities to learn, and that many children are not getting optimal amounts of literacy or math instruction that they really need to achieve their potential. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Big crowd. Thanks to Susan and the group for inviting me to come talk with you about this and to provide some commentary. It's great to see so many familiar faces around the room, and I see a number of people who ought to be up here reacting to these papers. But I think that this is a really exciting constellation of projects, and that really individually and collectively address a number of critical questions related to the Malleable factors that can help narrow the achievement gap. Each one of them examines some really interesting issues such as evidence-based curricula, the importance of that, and combining substantial coaching and training, the culturally relevant context within the classrooms and the families, extending it out to the homeschool environment, particularly relevant to increasingly diverse populations that are in the programs, which I'll come back to, the variations in of course, in the racial ethnic composition of samples, which is a big issue that I think we have arrived. So we're going to declare at the end of today that we are there now. And including, as when I talk about Peg's and her group's paper, the additional classroom factors that bring in some of the teacher-child race ethnicity matches, and then some of the really exciting new innovations in the direct child assessments and classroom observational measures, which I think really help to address some of our understanding of the key language and instructional processes that are kind of under the hood in terms of what's happening in the classrooms, and not just who's in the classroom pages. So there are a lot of important findings. I mean, I know a lot of this stuff is preliminary. A lot of important findings and a lot of lessons learned. I think what I wanted to do is I wanted to take each one of these and combine them together into one single study, because I think they all have really cool, interesting, unique things that taken together could be an amazing study. So Caroline, you got to do fun, like synergy of all of them. I know there's doing a lot of cross-fertilization across them. However, now this comes as no surprise to some people, despite my incredible enthusiasm about each one of them individually and collectively, there are also a few qualifications and or recommendations, that's the constructive way of putting it, that I think for these studies and for future studies, and I know that Peg and Joanne from MDRC and I were talking a lot out in the hallway about an hour beforehand about some of these issues, but I think that they really speak to some of the issues that all of them touched upon in terms of the challenges that they face with incorporating both their conceptualization, their analytic strategies, and their measurement strategies around the growing population of DLL students. I think the bottom line message is that we've made a lot of progress, but we still have a long ways to go with respect to capturing and understanding particular DLL language issues, which Cal talked about very nicely. Well, in terms of general language issues, not necessarily DLL, but also then the specific instructional practices, the intentional instructional practices that are targeted towards that, not just the way that Carol described them, but also beyond that in terms of for DLL children in particular. And then, of course, the big one is measures. It's kind of like location. Those of you who know me well enough know that measures is the big issue, big pet peeve of mine. So that's going to be a recurring theme in each one of these. And it's more as a constructive thing for the field as a whole. It's like, how are we continuing to struggle with these issues, and what do we need to do, whether it's from a funding point of view, whether it's from a selection point of view, some analytic point of view. There are a number of different challenges. So the first paper I think was really exciting because it captures this kind of the intentionality, the bold intentionality. And is Jason still on the phone? Mm-hmm. Hey, Jason. The other Jason, not you. I think that the Boston Public Schools represents a really innovative approach that I know others have modeled after. It goes beyond just a single study, a small sample, a small number of programs, to really try and look at selecting and implementing an evidence-based curricula, and then providing enough coaching and training. So really putting your money where your mouth is in terms of that, the inputs, the instructional practices that go on in creating a high-quality program. So I think that ought to be something that more efforts ought to be focused on, rather than continuing to do some of the status quo. Okay, we have these programs, these preschool programs that exist out there. We really need to be pushing further, and I know we can only do so much as if we're doing the research on them, but still, I think that needs to be a theme that needs to come through. So more Jasons, more Boston to be replicated. Otherwise, we're going to keep have some of these mediocre findings and kind of doing the same status quo. I've been doing this now for almost 30 years, and this is the same conversation we could have had for the Head Start Impact Study, for the Head Start Faces Study. So that's important. It's worth pointing out that 50%, I think, Joanne, right? 50% of the 32 were Hispanic in the Boston sample, and 50% were DLL, so there's some overlap there. It is no longer a subgroup analysis, and somebody mentioned about power. I think you mentioned the power issues, Megan. We need to be looking at constructing these samples in ways that have enough power to do some of these subgroup analyses, rather than just throwing in the towel and saying we don't have enough funding, we don't have enough power to do these. These are issues, they're no longer subgroup issues. I think some of the sub-classroom configurations are important to consider. We think of DLL composition, we think of either high or low and how many, or do they exist? But what are some of those sub-classroom configurations, and how are we thinking about teachers and assistant teachers? Because just because you have DLL kids in a classroom doesn't mean that the same teacher who has, remember the whole push for BAs, same teacher is going to be providing the instructional activities, so that even if you capture that, is it the teacher or is it the assistant teacher who happens to speak the other language, who might not have the educational credentials? So how are we thinking about those in terms of the configurations and the sub-classroom configurations for trying to capture some of this with DLLs and non-DLLs? And the misfit, so this is going to come up 4 times. The misfit of measures, like, are the measures that we are using, are they developed, designed, and tested for use with linguistically diverse populations? There are a number of them here that have not been, and I know that Peg was talking about, there's some, I think Peg and Joanna both mentioned there's some additional measures that are there, but we keep force-fitting some of these measures for the convenience of our analytic samples, because we have to analyze the whole group, and therefore we use, I think every single one of these studies use measures that were not designed for Spanish-speaking DLLs. Jason Anthony was here, but he left. There are a few efforts that have been developed to try and do a better job and move the field forward with measures that can capture. Then you have to look at what are they trying to capture and why are they trying to capture. Are we looking at DLL instructional practices and Spanish-speaking children's developmental trajectories in their home language or in their language of instruction? What is a language of instruction? Iheoma, I love Iheoma's bringing in the culturally relevant context. Of course, I expect that with Iheoma, nothing less, and bringing the home experiences, parenting practices, and homeschool connections. I think we need to go further beyond that, rather than the surface level, and to go into what are these culturally based roles and expectations for diverse families. Is Daryl Greenfield? Some in the hallway. One of his former grad students, I don't see Veronica here, but we had the story about the Hispanic backpack. I won't tell you about the grandparents. But basically, it's a really good illustrative example of, we think of home, we think of parents as children's first teachers, we think of the literacy activities at home, yet we ignore the fact that in some cultures, there are certain roles and expectations. You're the teacher, therefore you teach. I'm the parent, I parent. Now you're asking me to teach at home, so what are you going to do for me? And so that's a really important and non-ignorable factor that we need to take into consideration when we think about these culturally based norms and expectations. And again, measures, expressive vocabulary, I don't know how well it's worked with DLLs. I think some of the findings that we see, and I'm not talking necessarily as much about the findings, because I think some of the findings really raise the question of, is it truly closing the achievement gap, or is it reflecting English acquisition for the Spanish-speaking DLLs? The best way to get results, by the way, is have a DLL sample, because they're going to learn English in spite of what we do in the classroom. PEG study, again, another 35% Hispanic group. I think I loved the fact that she brought in the proportion of Black, proportion of Hispanic, teacher-child, racial, ethnic match. But as we were talking in the hallway, is it enough? It's a step in the right direction to look at that teacher-child match, but do we need to know, again, back to this classroom composition and the sub-classroom composition, what do we know about the language proficiency of the children and the teachers and that match? So going further beyond. And then the last one, Carol's paper, of course, I love new measures. Conversation we're here, seeing some of these new measures, we need some of these new measures. Expanding, I think we talked briefly beforehand about looking at, so what does this mean for the DL? How are we going to capture some of the DL instructional practices? There's a lot of potential there. So I think that it's real, and I'm going to steal your distance from recommendations for my measures commentary, because it's like for any given study, what's the distance from recommendations for the use of measures in this study? So be wary. So I think this is all great. Being bold about some of these different strategies. We're at the point where we can't ignore or overly simplify this growing cultural linguistic diversity of the population served. We cannot. And we have to look at the heterogeneity within the sample. So not only, this is like a double jeopardy, not only do we have to make sure that we're including large enough samples for these cross-racial ethnic group comparisons, but now you got to do within group variability, because we know that at least with the Hispanic population, I can't speak about other groups, but within the Hispanic population, there's a considerable amount of heterogeneity within, we're not all the same. And so different levels of language proficiency and other factors. And then finally, Psychometrics, back to the measures. Psychometrics matter. Don't want to go into great detail, because Caroline will kill me, but don't want to go into great detail. Psychometrics matter of our measures. We need to select measures that have been developed and tested for use, for appropriate use on these populations that we are including in our samples. I know we're stuck with some, and we need more funding for some of these to develop some of these new measures, but we really have to do a better job with what we currently have. But that's the lightning round. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, great. We have a few minutes for questions, so let's start out in the back.
So because it was funded by IES and because I'm very passionate about this issue, I have to tell you that we can't blame these fabulous panelists for the measures they selected because there was nothing out there previously. So we have just developed, thank you IES, the quills, which is for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, tests language and monolingual English kids in vocabulary, grammar, and their willingness, ability to learn new language items. And the quills ES, English and Spanish, will be coming out in like 2 or 3 months. And it recognizes that language is distributed across the languages that children learn, and comes up with a best score to see whether children should be recommended for intervention. So it takes both their Spanish and their English into consideration. And the tests are not just translations of each other, and we're very careful not to include cognates or other things that are problematic. So hopefully in the future, these fantastic projects will be able to avail themselves of measures that are better. I'm sorry if anybody created a GPT. It drives me crazy because you pray that a child fails if they're doing well, because it could take 8 hours, right? Till they fail 8 items in a row. So, and kids love this test. Yes. Sorry for the commercial, but it's pretty important.
Thank you for the presentations. Just out of curiosity, across all the presentations, the word disability was never mentioned. And I'm wondering if you are able to disaggregate children with disabilities or plan to.
I'll answer that. This is funded by NCER, and one of the aims of the projects is to identify some of these trajectories for typically developing children. So I think probably most studies, I know at least the Nebraska study, actually enrolled students who did not have a disability at time 1, at wave 1, which would have been the pre-K assessment. If children develop special needs or they're identified once the study is ongoing, then they're included in the sample, but it's relatively small subsample within most of the studies for that reason.
Well, just as a commercial, kids with disabilities represent at least 12% of the population. By Head Start requirements, they should be at least 10% of every class. And I just think that, even kids with language disorders, which represents our largest category, are going to be integrated across any sample that you do. And certainly from a disability perspective, it would be great. It's such a wonderful studies. It would be great to inform instruction for children with disabilities.
Absolutely. Yeah, we were precluded from that, but we agree wholeheartedly.
If I can just add something, especially to, I think regarding the question. So thank you for sharing information about the quails. I would also encourage that we also think about children who have a different language, like African American English vernacular. It is a language system. So I think while we're thinking about formalized language tools and measurements, we should begin to think about there are other language systems that are never accounted for, even in our current measurements.
Yes.
Yeah, Jim Delphimus, to jump on the measurement bandwagon just for a second, it's important to keep in mind that Woodcock Johnson applied problems is a sliver of what mathematical thinking is. And if that's not an indication of high quality mathematics thinking, but just a sliver of it, and the class, and even the instructional support, isn't really a very very good measure of high quality mathematical instruction, then you're missing a lot of, I think, what you're trying to go for with those. So it's just so important for us to maybe extend our reach.
I would know about,
those
and
measures.
I think we all agree. I think one key goal of this was to demonstrate achievement gaps. And I would just say that we actually also have for math the REMA measure. And we see the exact same pattern of huge gaps in REMA skills at the beginning of pre-K that are sustained across pre-K and kindergarten. But we also see similar patterns of different classroom instructional factors reducing those gaps. We actually didn't really look at gaps in DLLs in our study because of the major issues with measurement that were indicated related to assessing DLLs in language. So our study doesn't necessarily delve into the key factors that could reduce gaps in skills between DLLs and non-DLLs. But I think that having those better measures will allow for a more kind of complex understanding. But it was interesting that we see similar patterns, actually more striking gaps when we use a measure like the REMA that's taking into account a more complex set of mathematical skills.
I'm a little more than you. You raised a point from EPNA about the ways in which his study might also address policy level or structural level indicators that might make a difference for kids as well as the achievement gaps. And given you've got this designed in a way brilliantly across the U.S., you showed that beautiful map, are there ways to pull in information to try to get at some of these sort of more policy level factors, either on the early childhood space, i.e. having trained teachers, et cetera, but also to get at some of the issues that were raised so eloquently around home-school connection or racial matching for teachers and kids, which all are about the ways in which kids are experiencing this in the classroom.
Do you want to talk about special issue, Megan?
Yeah, we do have that first study is all around policy and the kinds of things that children are exposed to, like I said, at that macro level, but really at several interconnecting levels. We do have a special issue coming out in ECRQ. Do you want to say a few words about that, Megan? Is that right?
Yeah, so there's all the papers are now posted online, but the actual special issue will come out in May or June. And it basically summarizes key policy factors in each of these sites that are that are kind of evaluating how what we actually see in classrooms is related to the policies that districts and cities and states are implementing. And the studies are mixed methods, so they're primarily relying on focus groups, interviews with administrators, questionnaires by state policymakers. One key theme that we found throughout these policy studies is the focus on thinking about alignment between pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade instruction as we integrate pre-K systems across multiple auspices in early childhood. And the one key factor is relating to this particular session. Those policy studies don't get as much into thinking about achievement gaps. I think they're more focused on thinking about what are the policies that are in place to support all students. And I think that having that grounding is a positive first step, but I like the recommendation suggestion from Pamela to kind of move forward to think about how to integrate policy work in conjunction with this broader question of gaps.
And then I would just add that I think all of the sites have been just so busy collecting the data. And we finally now have systems in place, and we're just getting to the point where we can really talk about doing combined site analyses, and we're very excited about that. And trying to look at some of those questions is top on the list.
Yes.
Hi, Peg, I really enjoyed your talk. I enjoyed everything, but in your talk, I was really interested in the finding that in first grade, there no longer, or there became a gap between low income, black and white children, and I was wondering if you could speculate about that a little bit.
I mean,
in terms of why.
Right. I mean, probably like everybody. Everything is done on a need-to-be-done basis. And so we after running these analyses last week, it really became clear we need to go in and look at that question much more carefully. I mean, it's clear that something's happening in kindergarten, especially in grade 1, but especially, and probably in kindergarten and grade 1 for the Black students that, is exacerbating differences between the white and the Black kids. And we need to see if we can identify something in our data that accounts for that.
Can I just add one more thing?
So one of the things that occurred to me as I was listening to Peg and the occurrence of that gap is teachers' expectations and how they assess Black versus white children. And Novell Tanney has a very interesting paper that shows that even in the face of controlling for their actual achievement, teachers tend to rate Black boys as less academically competent than girls or Black girls. And Brandy Gatlin has another study with a completely different sample that showed this was a mixed SES, but primarily white sample, that teachers tend to underestimate the academic skills of children living in poverty. So one of the things as part of Iheoma's study is you might want to be looking at that.
And one thing we do have that, this is probably way too much information, but we do have information on each child and how much time they interact with the teacher, doing observations that are relatively limited, but we know something about how much time the teacher interacts with that child, the amount of time spent in literacy, the amount of time spent in math, and it will be very interesting to see if we also see gaps or if those relate to some of these differences that are emerging.
So I encourage you to look. I did a paper with colleagues that look at the transition for Black children, one on Black boys and one on Black girls, to look at that there are specific things that are happening from when children enter pre-K and then when they enter into elementary school. There's some specific things that are happening both on the micro level as well as the macro level. So I'm happy to get that link to you.
Okay, maybe one more question.
Yes.
Actually, I was really interested in how the homeschool connection made such a difference. Could you expound a little bit on what exactly the homeschool connection is and what specific incidences you saw on a successful homeschool connection that made such a difference?
I'll just take it at a time because we're out of time. I'm going to keep it real brief because we're out of time. But I would say this because I thought the question may come up. So we used the measure from Gian Fantuzzo that really looked at sort of the homeschool conference and how much conversations are happening, how much information is being shared across those two contexts. So I would just say this briefly, that I think what's happening is when parents, especially Black parents who have a history of being disenfranchised, are not, when there's a communication that's happening, there's much more understanding about what is happening at home, and then there's also this sort of dialogue that's happening about what's happening at school. So it's just the linkages that happens to, I think, reduce some of the sort of perceptions, biases. So there's a lot I can go into, and I think Sue can as well, but there's a lot that happens just in that sort of space that we could talk more about. So I'll just pause there. And there are some examples that I can share with you as well, and then I can go from there.
Thank you all very, very much. Have a great conference.